Yeah, I just want to welcome everybody and say thank you for coming. I'm very sorry some people won't be able to make it, but we are going to record it. So John's going to switch that on at some point. I don't know how, but and so I'm going to just introduce Selena, and then I'm sure she'll more than explain who she is when she gives her talk. But just a bit of background. Selena is actually from coastal Southern California, where she graduated with a BSc in zoology from San Diego State University in 2007. And she certainly had a very interesting life, teaching in California, carrying out seabird rehabilitation, and even zookeeping in Hawaii, and also working with bird specimen collections at various US natural history museums. And Selena arrived in South Africa in 2013. We're very lucky she did that, where she worked with penguins and other seabirds at Sandkop. And she's currently engaged with her PhD at the Fitzpatrick Institute at UCT, along with UKZN and the Nature's Valley Trust. And she's supervised by Peter Ryan and Mark Brown. And her thesis examines the effects of human activity and other factors on the breeding success of white-fronted plover and African black oystercatchers in the garden route. And as you know, those are our two breeding birds here on the Scarborough Beach. So it's very relevant to us. And white-fronted plovers are particularly concerning, having gone through steep population declines in the last 3 decades. And so part of Selena's project will be to develop appropriate conservation management plans to help balance human activities and coastal protection. So this evening, she's going to share some of her insights and knowledge with us. And it looks like it's going to be a very interesting talk. So I think hopefully I didn't get too much of that wrong, Selena. But yeah, we're really looking forward to talk, and thank you again for making time to give us this talk.
Thanks, Colleen, for a great introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to also speak with you guys and sort of give you guys a little preview to the wonderful world of waders or shorebirds. So let me share my screen. I can get this going. All right, so are you guys now seeing just the slide there?
Yeah, it's come through now.
Okay, sorry, I can't see the chat now that I'm screen sharing. But okay, so as Colleen mentioned, I'm Selena Flores, and in my talk today, I'll be sharing with you some of the work I've been conducting to measure and mitigate, which is sort of make better or find a solution, for disturbance on breeding white-fronted plovers in the garden route, particularly in the Plettenberg Bay region. And that is work I've been carrying out with the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town in conjunction with the Nature's Valley Trust, which is a local NGO here on this side of the Cape. And as Colleen mentioned, otherwise, I have been working with seabird and shorebird conservation for quite some time now. I think my experience stretching over a decade, which I cannot believe in that respect. And I've specifically been working with shorebirds and how people affect them since 2011. And some of the work that I did was particularly with the California government, so the sort of Cape Nature equivalent with our state or regional parks. And yeah, I started doing that in 2011, and I've actually used the insight and the cues from those types of programs, which have been relatively successful in the United States, and trying to apply that to the South African context with the white-fronted plover. And also, as Colleen had mentioned, I've worked in several other aspects of ornithology conservation in both research and in science education for again, the last decade or so. All right. So a little bit about the white-fronted plover, which is my study species, this cute little shorebird that I've been studying for the last several years. It's your classic beach plover. It's found across southern Africa, and they're quite small, this little sand-colored bird. They have great camouflage with their plumage or their feathers. They're small and low to the ground, and they also have these quite camouflaged eggs as well. So they're considered ground nesting shorebirds. They just don't even bother with anything going into the nest. They just say, okay, this place looks good, and plop their little eggs in there. So they breed from about September to March, though more recently we're finding them start as early as July, and there is sort of a variation across the country with the different climates across South Africa. They lay an average of 2 small little speckled eggs, and they also have this quite unique egg burial behavior, as you can see in this middle photo here, which really is only seen in one other species of plover, the Kentish plover, which occurs in some of Eastern Europe and in Asia. And they'll sit on these little eggs for about 1 month. And when the egg hatch, those chicks take another month and some change to fledge, which is to learn to fly or to be on their own. And both parents, male and female, have dual care duties, completely equal throughout this entire process. And with the egg burial, we're not quite sure what exactly this is for. There's lots of theories that this might be a leftover behavior out of nervousness, and they kind of sort of stamp their feet in excitement or nervousness, and that just happens to cover the eggs, and that gave some benefit for extra camouflage. It might also serve to help regulate the temperature in the nest, and that's very difficult to tease out, and it is something I'm looking into. That's a very difficult thing to study. And a bit more about them. It's the bulk of the species information about white-fronted plovers comes from studies that were done around the 1970s and mainly in the Western Cape. And then with some of the work done right there on the Cape Peninsula by Penn Lloyd, which was about 15 years ago. And while the shorebird may be considered common throughout Southern Africa, locally within the Western Cape, their numbers have declined around 40% in the last 30 years. And more alarmingly is the reduction in density, which has gone down about 60%. And they've also disappeared on some heavily disturbed beaches in the Cape Town region, like in Gordons Bay and in Blobergstrand. And seeing these populations declines is quite a problem, as these birds already have low potential output for each breeding season, but they're also assumed to be quite long-lived, potentially up to 20 years. And this issue has likely been present for a long time since we're seeing these declines. And on top of that, in the garden route, their local breeding success is also quite low, with only about 1/3 of the eggs hatching, and then normally about less than 1/4 of those chicks fledging. And that leads to an average overall success rate of less than 10%, which is very low. It's not particularly sustainable for a population. And just a little fun fact is that this middle photo here is a little tiny chick, only a few days old, and its mother that was on Scarborough Beach in March. So hopefully that little one made it. So where do these plovers even nest? They'll generally choose to nest in low, sparsely vegetated hummocks, or the little dune hills that you see going down to the beach, where they're going to have easy access to food sources, and they're also going to have good visibility of their surroundings that go all around them. So they want to be able to see where they can eat, they want to know where the restaurant is and what kind of food they serve, but they also want to know, like, oh, what dangers are around here, like what's the crime like, what's the traffic like over here. So they kind of sit around and look and kind of analyze their habitat and then choose where to nest accordingly. And so it's really hard to see because there's the coastline in Plet here on this map is quite large, but you can see these little dots in little clusters, and you can see a lot of red dots, which indicate failures of nests. So we're not seeing a whole lot of success, like I mentioned, less than 10%. So you can see that they happen in clusters, and there's these gaps in between some of the clusters. And those indicate an area of little or no nesting activity. You're calling them dead zones. And that's either from habitat erosion, or there's been lots of dense vegetation, which doesn't give them a very good visibility in that nesting area. Sometimes it'll be about predators. For example, in this sort of area here is the largest kelp gull colony in the whole of South Africa. So there's about 1,500 pairs of those birds, which are their #1 predator. So they want to absolutely avoid those areas. And in other gaps, these are where beach entrances are. So they're quite heavily disturbed, and the birds don't want to deal with that either. And here's one of our beautiful beaches in Plettenberg Bay. I'm sure this type of scene is very common and familiar to a lot of you in Scarborough. It's generally the scene that we see when we're starting out on our lovely beach walks, hopefully every day or at least several times a week that side. And clearly with a white-fronted plover sitting on the nest, right? Everybody can see it? No, I'm just kidding. They're very small and very difficult to see, and definitely difficult to see from this vantage point. So that red circle, that's where the nest is. That little tiny white dot is the bird. There's a better zoomed in view. So here, this is a bird, she's called Princess Leia, and she's doing a really, really great job of sitting on her nest very diligently and incredibly just camouflage, just disappearing into that scene. Here's another probably very familiar picture of this is when you look down while you're walking on the beach. This is pretty much what it's looking like, especially when you're closer to the dunes. And there is also a nest in this photo, if you can postulate a guess on where it is. And I'll click over to the answer. All right, so that red circle right there is the nest, which I was telling Colleen yesterday, even after a decade of working with these birds, sometimes they still fool me. So their camouflage is ace, it's spot on. So here's an even more zoomed in version. I mean, the picture gets so pixelated, you have to zoom in that far, they're so camouflaged. And their eggs are quite small. They're only about a couple centimeters long. So they're just so tiny, they get buried under the sand and that's it. It's just, they just sort of get swallowed by this whole landscape of the speckling with the debris that occurs on the beaches. And hopefully this video will play. So this is another sort of defense mechanism that the birds have, considering they're quite small. And plovers and other shorebirds, like this water thickney here in the video, they will actually fake injuries. So this one is feigning a broken wing. And this tells predators or other perceived threats toward a nest that, hey, look at me, I'm hurt, why don't you come after me? So the adult bird is kind of like a big juicy cheeseburger and the little chick or an egg is like one little tiny small French fry. And if you're a hungry predator or a hungry human, you're probably gonna go for that easy cheeseburger rather than just the one little French fry. But of course, this is all a ruse. So once the predator is convinced to chase the adult bird, it will either run or fly off immediately, tricking the predator and leaving that predator confused and not exactly remembering, like, oh, wasn't there a nest there or chicks there? Where was that? What was I doing? And most of the time they're let off far away that they wouldn't be able to come back to the nest to predate those eggs or those chicks. And so birds face a lot of sources of different disturbances on our beaches. People being one of them, predators trying to just cope with being a wild animal out there in the big bad natural world. So whether it's weather, predators, dogs, us, whatever or competition between other birds, there's lots of concerns that arise when birds are not able to stay on their nest and they have to respond to something else going on. So that can lead to them not being able to effectively incubate their eggs, keeping them warm, or in hot weather, keeping them cool. Opportunistic predation, so these quite clever predators taking advantage of the situation. I mean, we've got gulls in Plet that will sit on the top of dunes or sit ironically on our bird information signs, and they will survey the area and wait, just wait and look for a person or a dog to come through an area, scare the plover or the oyster catcher off the nest. They're watching where that bird ran away from, and they'll immediately go to where that bird ran from and nab the eggs or the chicks. So they're quite clever, they're very observant, and disturbance allows more opportunities for those types of predation events. Of course, as we saw with the camouflage photos, those birds just absolutely cover their eggs, completely blend them in. So there's a big risk of us accidentally stepping on the birds, us or our dogs, or separating the chicks from the parents, causing them to potentially perish. And also exposure of these nests and chicks to unfavorable weather conditions, whether that's heat, cold, wind, or rain, that all can cause risk for failure of the nest And just in general, when birds are being disturbed off their nests, there's a much increased likelihood that they will completely abandon their nesting attempt altogether. Now go over some of those risks. I'm sure most of you who are on the WhatsApp group saw the scientific paper that was shared there from Spain about dogs and how they disturb plovers that are on nest or in a certain area. And here's a graph. This is a really beautiful figure from that paper that I'll just use to sort of summarize what that paper even gets at, because sometimes they're just written in completely undecipherable scientific language. And so what this study shows is that walkers with dogs disturb birds to a much higher degree and far more often than just walkers on their own, or people just playing at the shoreline, standing or sitting, playing in the sand, spending time being stationary. So you can see walkers with dogs in the dunes nearly every time they have disturbed a bird off a nest or from their area, and dogs off lead disturb them every single time in dunes. Whereas if you're on paths with dogs, again, most of the time birds will be scared away. But if you're just on your own on a path, it's far less likely that that bird will respond to you. So this goes to show that just because a dog isn't chasing threats by the birds. So unfortunately, they don't understand that these are pets. They don't particularly want anything to do with the birds. They don't even know the birds are there, like we don't know the birds are there most of the time. But that dog has 4 legs, it has fur, it has a snout with teeth, its eyes are on the front of its head. It looks like the natural predators that go after plovers. So they're not going to take any risks, and they're just going to say, oh my goodness, I'm scared of this thing. This is what I instinctually know to do. And they just run away, leaving their eggs and their chicks quite exposed and vulnerable. And what we also did see in Plettenberg Bay within our observations of beachgoer behavior is that about 90% of the dogs were off the lead. So in this potential sort of situation where they're more likely to disturb birds than if they were on leads with their owners on a path or near the shore. It also shows that protecting the dune habitats is not just important for the stability of that habitat, but having people on paths is far less likely to disturb the birds versus having people in the dunes where it's nearly guaranteed that you're going to scare a bird. So to illustrate these dangers, here on the left, we've got a situation where a bird has been scared off the nest, and this person is dragging a big log of driftwood and walking. And here we can see right there is the nest. And this person just so happened to luckily not step on the nest. And we see so many instances of this all the time, especially in the summer when people flock to the beaches in Plettenberg Bay. And many nests, unfortunately, they're not this lucky, and they're trampled accidentally. And in the right-hand photo here, you can see this is a 1-egg nest that's on a pretty bare beach. So this egg is quite exposed, not just for trampling, like in the other photo, but also from the hot sun or from the wind, but also to predators. So part of my research was to outline and study how birds react, and that is to best inform how to prevent these types of disturbances and protect the birds. So how we did this was we conducted trials where we approached nests and then measured how and when the birds did different things to respond to us, which we were considered threats coming toward their nest. And so what we found is that the white-fronted plover actually starts responding from quite a distance. They're already watching you and thinking, oh, I don't know if I like this. Like, should I be watching this? Should I be running away? Should I be getting ready? And they'll start doing that from about 40 meters away, which is the length of 9 cars or 2 cricket pitches. And they'll start standing, getting ready to leave, burying their eggs at around 31 meters or 7 cars or half the total wingspan of a 747 plane. And then by the time you're 26 or so meters away, they're so scared. They say, look, I've got to bail. Like, this thing is probably coming near me. I can't let know my nest is here. I've got to get away now. And that's at 26 meters, about 6 cars, or just for fun, the height of 2 brachiosaurs laying down. All right, so it's important to keep in mind that these distances, and especially with how small the birds are, I mean, the adult birds can pretty much fit in the palm of your hand. And like I mentioned, the eggs and the chicks are quite tiny. Um, these are distances where it'd be really difficult for just normal beachgoer to even be aware that the bird was there, let alone even see the bird. And that these were these experiments, pardon me, that we conducted were very controlled trials where we walked directly to a nest, measured what was happening, measured the eggs, checked if they were alive, and then walked immediately away. Whereas the behavior of beach visitors is not that cut and dry. People like to linger. They like to watch the maybe the dolphins or the seals. They'll beach comb. They'll hang out with their dogs. And like I mentioned before in the last slide with the dog graph, those static disturbances where people are spending long periods of time lingering around nests will have a far more significant and far more negative impact with keeping the birds off the nest for much longer. In comparison to other coastal birds like oyster catchers and kelp gulls, which also breed on the ground on the coast, there are some quite significant differences. So oyster catchers are quite conspicuous. They're big, they've got this contrasted black and red that is very different from the beach coloration. So they need to respond a lot sooner to say, look, like they can see me from far away, I need to go now, to not at all let on that there's a nest or chicks there at all to an approaching or perceived threat. Whereas kelp gulls fall on the opposite side of the spectrum. They also don't need camouflage, and they don't need a longer response or further response because they're quite big, they're quite brutish. I mean, if anybody's been around a kelp gull in close range, they have no problem mobbing or pecking you. And they also nest in colonies, so there is safety in numbers with them as well. So the oyster catchers respond a lot sooner from a further distance, take a lot longer to go back to sort of conceal in any way that they can with their behavior because they don't have camouflage to distract a predator. And kelp gulls, they just beat you up if you come near their nests. So it's quite different than the plovers, who use that camouflage, their only line of defense, to make sure that they get away and keep their nests and chicks safe. Another thing we looked into was the exposure of eggs. So we were able to do these simulation experiments of what it's like for an egg that it gets exposed from a bird who's been flushed from sitting on the nest or incubating the nest. And we were able to do this with false eggs with tiny little temperature loggers fitted inside. And so this graph shows one of those trials with a fake egg just on your sort of normal summer December day around here, in the middle of the day when people are most likely to be on the beach to be in the water during the hottest portion of the day. And what we did find was that the temperature logger of this exposed egg could reach 41 degrees Celsius, which is sort of the upper limit of temperatures that an egg can survive at for long periods of time, within 5 minutes. And that is just about, as you can see here, 5.5 minutes is the average time it takes for a bird, a plover, to go back to its nest after it's been disturbed by a person or a dog or another bird. And by the end of this 2-hour trial, the exposed egg reached nearly 50 degrees Celsius, which is just absolutely, there's no way an egg can survive that. It's pretty much fried. And there was a nearly 19-degree difference between an egg kept in the shade to simulate a bird shading its eggs in the heat versus this egg that was out in full sun. So this is quite concerning that if birds are being kept off the nest, they have a very, very small window of time to be able to get back to their nest in order to make sure that their eggs stay viable, stay alive. All right, and so the chicks are also just as vulnerable. We've been talking a lot about nests and how the birds respond while they're sitting on the nest, but the chicks also are at risk, and they're quite difficult to manage because they're not in a stationary egg sitting in a nest. These are tiny little mobile things. They can run around 10 or 20 minutes after hatching. They can feed themselves immediately. They don't stay in the nest. I've had birds go 500 meters away overnight the day that they hatch. So these things just get up and go the second they're born. But they also rely solely on camouflage. So if you've been able to find the chick in this photo as well, it's very difficult. It's the same as the nests. So this is where the chick is. This is its head, its little beak, and this black line is its back. And there's another zoomed in photo of it. So you can see these cute little cotton balls on toothpicks. And this behavior is called crouching. So the parents, they can see that a threat is coming soon, and they make what's called the chick whistle. So it's sort of this sort of upward two-tone, and that tells the baby birds to get down, stay down, and they will just lay perfectly still in the sand, and they just, again, completely disappear into the debris where they're feeding. So again, they're at risk of trampling, exposure to the elements, predation, and they can also starve if they are disturbed for long enough. Here's another little challenge example of where this chick might be. And here's the zoomed in answer. I mean, these chicks, again, are just a few centimeters across. They're so tiny, and you can see, even though I'm right on top of it, it's not going to move. It just says, nope, mom told me to stay here and be quiet and stay down. And until they get the signal to come back and start feeding again with them, they will stay in this position. So yeah, they're quite vulnerable. So some interesting results that we did find when it comes to disturbance levels on different beaches and the success of these birds on those beaches is that there seems to be a Goldilocks or just right level of disturbance on beaches that can actually benefit the breeding success. And Penn Lloyd, like I said, about 15 years ago, did some studies on the Cape Peninsula, and he also found similar results as well. So with these more secluded or more heavily vegetated beach sites, like here in Plettenberg Bay, for us, that's the Kierbomstrand area, which is the least disturbed beach, they don't do very well, particularly because there's a higher instance of predators. With a lot of vegetation and when things are very quiet, all wildlife will flock there. So not just the birds. So a lot of people have said, well, what about birds in reserves? We've got protected areas. Why aren't they nesting there? Well, it's sort of, in America, we have a sort of classic movie quote that says, build it and they will come. It's in reference to a baseball field, but in this respect, if you have a nature reserve that's quiet, secluded, access is restricted, if you create that nature reserve, everything will go there because they want to avoid people. So the birds aren't able to effectively raise their chicks or even hatch their chicks because there's just way too many predators and too much of a variety of predators. So you've got snakes, caracals, baboons, kelp gulls, birds of prey, whereas in more disturbed areas, there might be less predators, but there's just absolutely no way these birds can effectively sit on their nests, such as with our Robert Beach here. It's just so busy, covered with people and dogs pretty much all the time. So those birds are on the other side of the spectrum, not able to do well because they just can't get enough of a break from people disturbing them to successfully nest. And then that sweet spot, that just enough amount of disturbance, has been occurring on Lookout Beach and at Nature's Valley Beach, which are actually two of the smaller beaches in the area. But they have a sort of moderate amount of visitors coming through, which keeps some predators or most predators at bay. And also it's not so disturbed that they're still able to look after their chicks and their nests in order to get them to learn to fly. So surprisingly, on our smaller beaches, we're seeing far higher levels of success and far higher levels of birds nesting there. And these numbers, you're probably wondering what these mean. These numbers are the average numbers of people and dogs on a beach at any 1 hour across their 8-month breeding season. So in the view of a bird's nest, and then how many times they are on average flush off a nest in 1 hour. So some of these, like with Robberg, the most disturbed beach, you can see there's 180 people within that bird's visual range sitting on the nest. And 15 dogs, whereas Kierbooms, which is very, very isolated, there's only about 22 people at any one time. And though these flushes might seem, from the nest, might seem like, oh, it's only 2 times in an hour, big deal, it can go back. A lot of these flushes are not, like I said, aren't going to the nest and moving on. It's going to the nest, people kind of linger in the area a little bit. So they might only be off the nest 3 times an hour, but the length of time they're off the nest varies a lot. So from all of these concerns, the Share the Shores program was started with the Nature's Valley Trust. And the shorebird portion of Share the Shores particularly involved informative and illustrated signs at beach entrances, and then also 3 signs placed around each nest, creating a symbolic barrier with a 30-meter radius to encourage people to stay away from the area. There was also stewardship and interventions. So we were out on the beach conducting questionnaires to measure awareness and to sort of guide interactions to increase awareness with beach visitors. We also did engage with people who were actively infracting regulations, and also encouraged compliance through particularly very positive diplomacy. It was always a positive experience. We never were wagging our fingers and saying no, no, no. It was always a encouraging interaction, or at least we attempted for that. There's also an outreach campaign over social media, which reaches about 500,000 people every year. And our campaign also appears in about 40,000 distributed materials across the Plettenberg Bay region every summer season, in hopes that we will get the word out. So you're probably thinking, well, you're putting in all this effort of being out on the beach, putting signs up, monitoring these birds. Is any of these efforts, are they working? And compared to our control years, we did see when we're putting signs up, we're engaging with people on the beach, we do see significant increases in hatching, fledging, and in overall success. And that leads us to be cautiously optimistic. We're very happy that this seems to be working, but we need to take it with a grain of salt, that there's a lot of different factors that influence success. This can vary year to year. And also, we only had less than 10% success rate. So even though we're seeing over 50% increase in that, it's still very low. It's not quite enough to maintain a stable population. And also, here's some tips of what you can do in your daily life in Scarborough. So you can keep your dogs on leads. That's a huge benefit, or away from beaches where they're not allowed. Walking near the water or the wet sand on the shore, watching where you step, as we saw again from that study in Spain. Keeping dogs and people on the shore has the least likelihood of disturbing a bird. Watching where you step, since of course those eggs and chicks are very camouflaged. Making sure you're taking all your rubbish, especially fishing gear and other items with you, so the whole leave only footprints concept. So this nest that's lining the side of the nest, this poses a great entanglement risk. And in the years of my study, we've seen a lot of entanglements and a lot of bird death from fishing line in particular. So making sure you take everything with you. If you see rubbish on the beach, please remove it, put it in the nearest bin. And then also to just be mindful with the beach signage and the regulations that are posted. They are never there to ruin anyone's fun. Absolutely not. There is good and sound reasoning behind them. And it's quite the irony, or the sad irony of it, is that the more that these beach regulations are broken, or the rules are broken, the situations or issues that the regulations aim to address will persist, probably worsen, which then leads back to the regulations needing to become stricter. So respecting those guidelines is actually in everybody's best interest, from visitors also to the ecological functioning of the area as well. And the bonus is to look for shorebirds because they're cute and really awesome, which I hope you've seen from this presentation. All right, and that's it for me. Thanks so much. I'm happy to take any questions or feedback, and otherwise you can send me an email if you'd like as well.
Wow. Very smooth. Wow, Selena, thank you. That was amazing. Colleen, can I start with the first question? Yeah, it's about, the oyster catchers, they always come back in the same place, almost as they have like a GPS, that's incredible, it's like spot on, But we notice the plovers, they're kind of all over the place. That's like the normal behavior, or?
Yeah, the plovers are a little bit more active. So the oyster catchers, these birds know what works and they know where works. So the plovers have much larger territories than the oyster catchers, and they're a bit more aggressive in defending them. So they will definitely just sort of pick where looks best and who essentially they can fend away from their territory. So I've seen a lot of plovers changing territories, changing mates. It is like a soap opera out there. And if you follow the Nature's Valley Trust on Facebook, we actually have sort of a joke called the sands of change or the sands of time, something like that, that kind of goes over our different pairs and who is sort of overthrown who. But the oyster catchers, yeah, you're right. They're going to stick a little bit more to their established territories. I mean, I've seen birds go not even 20 meters from their last nest, or even on the top of the same dune. Whereas the plovers are like, yeah, right, that didn't work. Like, I'm going to go over here now. So yeah, what you're seeing is pretty normal.
Great. And another thing that we notice as well, that when we start the season here, as we close the area, the nesting areas, we find that the plovers, they kind of slowly move into the area because they can see there's less traffic. So it's different working for the plovers as well, as much as the oyster catch. So it's very happy. And it sounds like Scarborough, we are like in a golden lock setup. So
yeah.
So,
yeah, you're able to have the just right amount of disturbance where it's not too much that the nests are getting trampled or the birds can't sit very well, but it's also not too little that the predators are coming through those nice vegetated dunes that you have. Even though they're definitely there, even if you don't see the caracal or don't see the leopard or baboons, they're definitely going there. And even the otters as well. But yeah, that Goldilocks area it's working for the plovers here. And so how we manage and utilize that Goldilocks situation is focusing on protecting more voraciously or more aggressively those Goldilocks beaches, and then allowing these other beaches where the birds aren't doing well in general for natural or disturbance reasons, as those are what we call, it's not a very nice word, but in conservation we call them sacrificial beaches, so that we have areas where people can have their dogs running off lead on, say, Robberg Beach, which is our most disturbed beach. That's the longest stretch of dog off lead area because there's only 2 pairs there, to kind of say, well, we'll kind of give up these 2 pairs to allow the 17 to 20 pairs at Lookout or Nature's Valley Beach to have a really good chance. That's sort of worth the balance when you're creating conservation management programs.
Thanks, Selena.
I see someone has asked the question, do plover couples stay together for life like oyster catchers? Far less than oyster catchers. Like I said, it's like a soap opera out in Plet with all our different plovers. It's quite hilarious. Even oyster catchers, they will swap pairs. I've even seen, and it's been documented in other places, that oyster catchers, they have like threesomes. So there'll be 1 male and 2 females sitting on a nest. I've like watched this happen in Kierbooms more than once, and for several years, the same 3 sort of breed in this one stretch of beach. Several, maybe 50 meters away from each other, 100 meters away from each other. But I just see the 1 male going from one nest to the next nest, and he sits on that nest and then goes to the other one and sits on the other nest. So that's, it's quite amazing. But the plovers, even though a lot of the literature, so if you look in Roberts or you look in the research that Penn Lloyd did out in Nordhook and Komaki, I think maybe a little bit in Scarborough, he might have done a few little things there, and at Cape Point there's a lot of birds. What his research showed on that side of the world, in the peninsula, is that these plovers actually, they have what's called very, very high mate fidelity. They stay on the site where they nest best, they stay with the partner that's working best for them, and in Plet we are absolutely not seeing that. We are seeing the birds going from this beach to that section of the beach. Oh, now they're with this female. Nope, now they're with this female. Within one season, between seasons, the chicks the fledglings are flying a lot further than what's been documented in previous literature. So it's very exciting as I'm starting to sort of get more concrete results coming out of where these birds are going and what exactly they're doing. It's really interesting to see how that compares to past research. All right, I see Dave has a question. How many breeding pairs are there estimated in South Africa now? We actually don't know because it's considered a least concern or common species. there isn't a lot of sort of quite active research going on. To my knowledge, this project is one of, and your beach as well, is one of the very few situations where the breeding is actually being monitored in any sort of regular fashion. The highest density of white-fronted plovers in South Africa is thought to be West Coast National Park, but again, they don't do very well in these protected reserves because of the predation. So though we may have 1,200 pairs, give or take, in West Coast National Park, it's still what's considered a population sink, since they're not able to successfully fledge a lot of chicks. Okay, and then Patrick is asking about the type of messaging that works best when it comes to getting compliance with conservation messages. So that's sort of part of what my project aimed at. It wasn't just solely breeding biology, hardcore science. There was a sort of social science and citizen science aspect to it, where we, at this point, since PhDs are only so many years until you must hand in your thesis, I've only really been able to look at the sort of level of awareness and what types of gaps there might be in knowledge acquisition or knowledge retention when it comes to our campaigns. And it will take quite a few years of continued research, which unfortunately just within a short-term PhD, I don't particularly have the capacity to look into that portion of things. But I'm hoping that with cooperation like with SEG and with the Nature's Valley Trust, that further studies or observations of how this level of awareness, and if we are filling those gaps of knowledge awareness, and how exactly to harness that concern or level of investment or passion like you guys have in Scarborough, and using that for effective increases of awareness and protection and management of our beaches in beneficial ways.
Selena, I have a question.
Yep.
Selena, did you say that the oyster catcher is a bird which is of least concern, common species?
No, that's the white-fronted plover. The oyster catcher is considered near threatened.
Sorry, the plover. The plover is least concern, common species.
Yes.
Right. And that means that it's not an endangered species.
It's not endangered, but currently the trends that we're seeing in the population is that the population is declining. That has been documented. And so
why did you choose to research such a species? Is it because they play? Is it because they play a certain role in coastline ecology?
They're great indicator species. Particularly, they can tell us how what's the level of disturbance that humans are imposing on the beach, which is great information, because with climate change and erosion of beaches from development, it tells us, are the beaches stable and how well are they doing? They're sort of a free alarm system when it comes to the levels of disturbance. But your question is,
it's a barometer. I suppose it's unusual for a researcher to dedicate their time to a least concerned common species, right?
It's not. A lot of researchers study common birds, whether it's in the UK and probably globally. One of the most common birds we have is the tit in the UK. People do tons of studies on tits. It's by and large one of the most studied bird species, though they are common. They're in people's gardens.
We could say these are barometer species that by understanding them and their population, it gives you a look in on sort of knock-on and consequential effects.
Exactly. And then I also chose the white-fronted plover because knowing we have this sort of already early warning that says, look, we've seen 40% decline in population, 60% decline in density. Something is going on. Just because they're not endangered yet, we want to prevent that. A lot of conservation, like you're saying, many people want to study endangered species, and there is this huge gargantuan bleeding heart effort with rhinos, with penguins that say, save these things.
Right.
But what if we took conservation of a different approach? Instead of it being reactive, we're being proactive. Right. We already have those warning signs that, ooh, this is going downhill. This is not going to be good in a couple more decades. And we're going to see similar situations like in the United States. So I used to work with the government in California on the endangered western snowy plover and endangered California least tern. These birds are now at a point where they are management dependent. They have to build fences. They have to exclude people up and down the coast. And that is logistically, financially, I mean, it is a nightmare. It is these huge undertakings, and you need support, you need money, you need organization from top-down situations, and that's not quite what goes on in South Africa. So this study is sort of exploring different ways, particularly from the ground up instead of the top down, to get people on board to say, look, we don't want Scarborough or Plet to have a bunch of signs and a bunch of fences up. So we've got to choose to, as people, with that reasoning, with that decision-making ability, to change our behavior on the ground. So doing easy things like putting your dog on a lead, making sure you're not disturbing the dunes, and you're still able to thoroughly enjoy the beach by doing those things. And that will ensure that these birds don't go further into decline, or at the very least, we slow down the decline while we're still figuring out the most effective solutions.
Amazing.
Thank you.
I see. So Patrick had a question about impact of predators, the ideal set of circumstances that promote breeding success. So I'm actually looking at that with my thesis of layering sort of this level of vegetation and this presence of predators and this presence of people, and how does that influence success? So it's quite a extensive, very complicated analysis, which even at this point, this is the point of a PhD, I don't know how to do that yet, but I'm trying to figure out what is the best way to go about modeling this or creating sort of a way we can predict what's best for them. So I can't answer your question about the ideal set of circumstances yet, but I really hope that I figure out some kind of general model for that by the end of my thesis. And Andrew has asked two questions. Are we seeing habituation? In some ways. So the birds, the big source of habituation I see is they're habituated to me as an individual. So I've actually caught about 10 of our 40 pairs on the nest with my bare hands. They just come right back to the nest while I have the eggs in my hand. They will just come and be like, ugh, you again. But so I actually couldn't conduct those distance experiments by myself, because I think they know my gait, the way I walk, and I think they also recognize my voice. Because when you're out there on the beach by yourself for the most part at 4 o'clock in the morning, you talk to yourself and you talk to the birds. It's only a problem when they talk back. And those birds would sort of hear me coming and see me coming and be like, oh, this lady. And they would either respond a lot sooner than they would to the general public, saying like, oh, here comes a lady who's going to take my eggs again. Or they might be like, oh, here comes that lady. She just touches the eggs and puts them back. I'm not even going to bother to run away. So I'm seeing definitely habituation to me as the researcher who visits the nests very often. And there's a lot that's been published about habituation to people and tolerating or weighing out that balance of, should I react to these things, these sort of featherless animals that walk on 2 legs? Should I react every time and in such a way that I stay away from my nest, or should I just cope with this fear and sit for a little bit longer and make sure I can look after my young? And that habituation has led to higher breeding success in those Goldilocks areas. And his second question, lower breeding success in protected areas, natural, but the white-fronted plovers don't breed successfully enough to maintain local populations in these sort of pristine nature reserves because of predation. So the plovers, the issue there is not exactly adaptation. It is squeezing so many different forms of wildlife into a very small area when it comes to nature reserves. So kind of how I put it when I was working with the government is we would create this 20-mile long or 25-mile long protected area that was outlined by a fence, no people, no horses, no surfers, no dogs, no nothing in that area. And we restored and enriched the habitat to be as beneficial and as pristine or close to natural as possible, that would encourage these birds to nest there. And they absolutely did. but it also attracted a ton of predators. So not only were we creating this very beautiful habitat that would do wonderfully for the birds, we were also creating bird buffet in this very small area for the predators. So like you were saying, Andrew, these areas are fantastic habitat. They're not disturbed, but they're these sort of relatively small areas where many birds are trying to breed there, many predators are trying to survive there. So it just sort of increases the density of their occurrence, whether that's the birds themselves and the predators. So I hope that answers your question. And Colleen says that the protected areas don't have the full set of predators that might control the smaller ones. You know, we haven't seen issues with smaller predators, say like rats and mice and things like that. We're mainly seeing issues with kelp gulls. Did have some genet issues, but nothing like even like snakes or anything like that. Had a couple times with otters and whatnot, but they're, you know, going under the cover of dark anyway and not really caring much about disturbance. So yeah, the protected areas, they actually have a larger suite of predators, and that's become an issue. So in the more disturbed areas, we weren't seeing genet, caracal, fox, otter, or snakes or anything else, but we were seeing mouse and rat tracks, though they weren't, to my knowledge, taking nests. It's very difficult to tell who might have taken the eggs, especially if they run off with the egg. It's impossible to tell who did it unless they actually leave really nice tracks that stick around for a while. So yeah, we kind of actually see a larger set of predators in the protected areas because they don't tolerate disturbance as well as gulls or rats or mice. Oh, can't hear you, Colleen. Thanks, Callan.
Do you want? Okay.
There's always bound to be some technological situation.
And it's usually because I can barely get anything to work. Yeah, so sorry about that. Yeah, no, just that Patrick was saying, do you think that fish in protected areas may have similar issues, that like everything gets squashed into that area and that pushes up the predation pressure? I guess it's
I don't study fish. I've never studied fish. I've been studying birds for 15 years. So I don't really know about fish predators. They've done some studies with the seals here at the Robert Peninsula, looking into the otoliths, the ear bones, of what the seals are eating, but the function of that was more so to say, like, are they actually in competition with shore-based fisheries, which proved it wasn't. But there's also been, quite interestingly, a shift in not just abundance, but types of species of fish that are being caught along our coast here in the last, say, 20 years. There's been like a complete overhaul, a complete difference of what people are catching, the sizes, they're significantly smaller, and then the catch per unit effort is also much smaller. So they need 2 hours now in comparison to catch the same as what they did 20 years ago in 1 hour. So yeah, there's obviously there's something going on with the delineation of the MPA, but that also could definitely be predator abundance or density, obviously climate change. We do know that stockfish for particularly the main prey of penguins are moving toward the southern Cape in comparison to them being on the west coast and the eastern Cape in previous years. So yeah, there's definitely shifts going on for a variety of reasons with fish as well in protected areas.
Very interesting, actually. Any more questions, anyone?
Oh, awesome. Nordhook as well. That's awesome, Andrew. It's so nice to see Share the Shores like spreading across South Africa. It's like gives you the nice warm and fuzzy feelings that, you know, academia, as Callan knows very well, and you as well, Colleen. It's sometimes a little bit thankless. You go, what am I doing this for? But yeah, engaging with your communities like this is, yeah, really makes everything worthwhile. You know, it's really going to help me also push through this final several months of writing up my thesis.
Cool. Good luck with that.
Thanks, Callan.
Thanks for the talk, and thanks to everyone in the background for organizing it.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And definitely, Selena, yeah, good luck with that last push. You've obviously got all your data now, so good luck.
Yeah, make it mean something now.
Oh. Any last questions, anyone, before we close off? No? Oh, great. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it all remains is to say thank you again, Selena. It was a really fascinating talk. You had definitely had us enthralled with that. It was really interesting, and playing spot the egg was quite a challenging game. I think I'd be quite rubbish at it, so I'll be very careful where I talk in future. So, yeah.
And I've sent you the PDFs of those images so you can circulate them as well. If people really want to try their luck without the circles around them.
Great. But yeah, thanks again. We really appreciate it, and good luck with this year's Share the Shores on your side, and we'll do our best on this side.
Right. Thanks again for having me, guys. Have a good.
Well, thanks
good
very
rest of
much.
your week.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.